Good evening. And welcome back to History Before Sleep. Tonight's story is a quiet one. Heavier, yes, but not frightening. Not dramatic. Just honest. Because we're going to talk about death. Not death with fanfare or swords or saints, just the kind that happens when someone stops breathing in a small village, and someone else has to pick up the shovel. If you've ever wondered what would happen if you lived in the year 1300, and died without wealth or fanfare or any particularly useful legacy, this story is for you. Spoiler alert, there are no coffins. Not many prayers. And zero floral arrangements, unless someone was thoughtful enough to stuff rosemary up your sleeves to mask the inevitable. But before we begin, I invite you to get comfortable. If you'd like, tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are? And where in the world are you listening tonight? It's comforting to know that we're sharing this quiet moment, even if separated by miles and time zones. Please take a moment to like this video, and follow the channel. That way, whenever you need a quiet companion to help you sleep, you'll know exactly where to find us. Tonight isn't about grief. Not really. It's about how death was simply part of life. Inescapable. Normal. A thing to be worked around like rain or spoiled barley. So we'll follow the quiet ones. The woman who washed the body. The priest who arrived late. The boy with the spade, whose hands are already cracked from the cold. We'll walk with them through the rituals that history never bothered to glorify, but that kept people dignified, even when no one was watching. Take another deep breath. Let your thoughts wander. Nothing needs solving. No one is waiting for an answer. Just a sleepy little village. A bell is about to ring, a faint, familiar sound of someone being quietly remembered. Now, let's begin. In the year 1300, when someone died in a village, the news did not travel in whispers or letters or solemn men in long black coats. It traveled on the wind in the form of a single bell, and it came from the small wooden tower above the church, the same bell that had rung for feast days, for saints, for warnings of fire. But when it rang in slow intervals at dawn, people knew. It meant that someone, somewhere nearby, had passed from the world of the living. There were no announcements. No printed notices. No one needed to knock on a neighbor's door to deliver the news. Instead, the bell tolled once for each year the deceased had lived, and the village listened, not out of obligation, but because they always did. People would stop where they were, placing hands still dusted in flour on the edge of a table, or pausing mid-step on their way to the well, counting each sound with a quiet kind of curiosity that didn't need permission to exist. In that way, it was a shared ritual, even if no one ever spoke about it aloud. You listened. You counted. You tried to guess who it was before anyone confirmed it. The children were often the first to respond, eager to show off their counting skills by shouting numbers into the morning fog, oblivious to the weight of what they were counting. Older villagers reacted with silence, faces blank but eyes calculating. Women stopped kneading dough or lifting water jugs and glanced at one another. Men wiped their hands on wool tunics and nodded without comment. Everyone listened. Everyone wondered. And no one asked. Not yet. In this particular village, on this particular morning, the bell rang 34 times. 34 slow, echoing strokes. Long enough for every soul in the area to hear it, count it, and begin to form a guess. And behind the stable, in the small lean-to that Elias called home, a boy of 17 put down his knife halfway through peeling a parsnip and reached instinctively for the spade leaning against the wall. He didn't need to ask who had died. That would come later. His part came first. Elias was not a priest, nor a healer, nor the sort of boy anyone noticed first. But he was strong, and quiet, and used to the rhythm of things, and he had, by now, buried more people than he cared to count. He didn't see it as grim work. Not exactly. But he did understand the timing. The bell rang. The digging began. The name, the morning, the ritual, all of that came after. What mattered now was the soil. The cold. The width of the grave. Whether or not the ground would give easily, or whether it would resist, like it sometimes did in late winter. He wrapped his cloak tighter around his shoulders, pulled the hood low over his forehead, and stepped out into the village path without looking back. The cold stung his face. Smoke drifted from one chimney. A goat bleated behind a low stone wall. Life, as always, went on. Except for one person. One person whose name had not yet been said, but whose life had just been measured by 34 distant bells. The house is quiet, but not the cozy kind of quiet. Not the kind where someone's just made tea and the cat's asleep on the windowsill. This is the thick, uncomfortable silence that happens when someone has died, and everyone in the room knows that the most useful thing they can do now is move. The body has already been placed on the bench by the hearth. And before you imagine something ceremonial or respectful, let's be clear, this is the same bench where bread is kneaded, infants are changed, and chickens occasionally perch when no one's watching. There's no separate death room in a 14th century peasant home. There's barely a bed. The body lies where there's space, wrapped in a woolen blanket that smells faintly of onions and smoke. No one's crying loudly. That's not how it's done. Loud crying is for nobles or saints or public tragedies involving horses. This is quiet grief. Practical grief. The kind where someone is already boiling water not for tea, because tea is a luxury no one here has even heard of, but for washing the dead. Someone, usually a woman who's not too old to lift but old enough to be unshocked, steps forward with a basin. It's just well water, and it's always cold. No one's invented warmth yet, not in houses, not in water, and certainly not in their emotional vocabulary. The washing begins at the face. Eyes that are no longer seeing, cheeks that no longer flush. Arms, legs, chest. There's no perfume, no soothing lavender soap, no gently scented wipes. Just cloth, water, and the quiet scrape of a body cooling faster than anyone can admit out loud. The room smells like it always does, of wool, of burnt porridge, of feet. It's easy to assume the smell of death would stand out. It doesn't. Not in a world where personal hygiene is mostly aspirational. If you've ever walked into a teenager's bedroom in August and thought, "What died in here?" Well, now you know. In 1300, the answer might genuinely be someone. The shroud is a plain piece of linen, usually set aside long in advance. Sometimes it was part of a woman's dowry. Sometimes it was a leftover table covering. Linen was valuable, but dignity still mattered. The body is wrapped tightly, not for presentation, but for practicality. Think less laid to rest in peace and more bundled like a slightly unfortunate parcel with a short delivery window. If the eyes refuse to stay closed, and they often do, a few quick stitches will take care of it. It's not meant to be gory. It's just another task on the list, like chopping wood or emptying the chamber pot. Death, after all, doesn't come with a cleanup crew. It comes with whatever neighbor is brave enough to thread a needle. If the garden's been kind, they'll add herbs. A bit of rosemary tucked at the neck. Maybe some thyme pressed into the cloth. But if it's winter, and the herbs are gone, well, you hope the draft keeps things tolerable. There is no embalming. No preserving gel. No overnight refrigeration while distant cousins fly in. You bury the body within a day because, frankly, not doing so would become unpleasant for everyone. And this is the moment that always feels the strangest. When everything has been done, washed, wrapped, arranged, and yet the person still looks like they might sit up and ask what all the fuss is about. But they don't. They never do. And so the room waits, hovering between yesterday's warmth and tomorrow's burial, while someone adjusts the linen one more time, smoothing it flat not for beauty, but for the quiet dignity that remains. Outside, the firewood cracks in the hearth, the pot simmers on low, and the woman who has done this before, too many times to count, wipes her hands on her apron and nods to no one in particular. The body is ready. And somewhere in the corner, someone is already wondering if they'll get the blanket back. By the time Elias reaches the burial ground, the sun has barely climbed above the tree line, and the frost still clings to the edge of the ditch like a miser clings to his last coin. The village graveyard isn't behind the church, like in the grand cities, framed by rows of carved stone and angel wings. No, here it squats on the edge of a tilting hill behind the last row of cottages, half swallowed by weeds, half flattened by sheep who couldn't be bothered to go around. There's no path, just the memory of one, a slightly worn trail through the grass where boots have passed often enough to press the soil. The land is lumpy, uneven, marked only by the occasional crooked wooden stake or the leftover shape of a hole half collapsed by time and weather. No names. No dates. No one left behind enough coin for that. This is where the peasants are buried. The forgettable ones. The ordinary ones. The ones whose greatest claim to history is that they made it through another planting season without starving. And now, another one is ready to join them. Elias steps onto the frost-bitten patch he's chosen, not because it's sacred or suitable or any such thing, but because it's soft enough to yield and not already occupied, as far as anyone remembers. There is no map. No registry. Just educated guesses and the occasional bad surprise when the spade hits something it shouldn't. The digging starts the same as it always does, one boot pressed against the shovel, one hand wrapped tight around the handle, one inward sigh that says, "Here we go again." The soil is stiff, the way soil always is when you need it not to be. In summer, it crumbles into your boots. In winter, it clings like guilt. Today it's somewhere in between, reluctant, but not hostile. There's a rhythm to it, if you can call it that. Spade in, lift, turn, dump. Again. 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 Every so often Elias straightens up and rolls his shoulders, but there's no real break. There's no one else to take over. And unlike the living, the dead are surprisingly punctual. The grave doesn't need to be deep. No one's checking regulations. There are no burial inspectors. Just enough space to lay the body without offense. Just enough cover that the foxes don't get curious. Just enough effort to feel like someone tried. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks. Somewhere closer, a woman is beating dust out of a rug with a stick. The world continues around him, as if someone hasn't just died and someone else isn't standing ankle-deep in dirt, trying not to think about the weight of a body that will soon lie where his spade now cuts. As he works, Elias can't help but notice the way the ground shifts slightly beneath him. The hill is slanted just enough that nothing stays level for long. Not the graves, not the memories, not the living. Over time, the whole place has begun to lean downhill, as if even the land itself is trying to forget what it's holding. He thinks, not for the first time, about how arbitrary it all is. Where someone is buried. Whether they are remembered. Whether anyone bothers to mark the spot. Some families carve initials into a tree, or place a single stone. Others don't come back at all. A few forget before the body's cold. You don't get a tombstone, he mutters to himself, unless someone remembers you loudly. And most people? They're buried like secrets. Folded into the soil with as little fuss as possible, covered up, and quietly left behind. There's no ceremony in the digging. Just the work of it. Just the truth of it. And Elias knows that truth better than anyone. The shovel hit something hard. A root, probably. Or not. He doesn't look too closely. There's no time. He shifts, moves, adjusts the angle, keeps going. The sun climbs another inch, as if trying to remind him that the day is moving, even if he isn't. Eventually, the hole is ready, not perfect, not level. But it's ready. Deep enough to contain. Not so deep that it becomes impossible to climb out. Elias tosses the last clump of earth to the side, leans on the handle of his spade, and stares down into the shape he's made. It's strange, standing above an empty grave, knowing exactly who will fill it and when. Strange how normal it feels. He wipes his forehead with the back of his wrist, smearing a line of dirt across his temple, and exhales once, not dramatically, just to let the cold back out. The work is done. For now. Soon the others will come, the priest, the family, the watchers. Soon there will be words spoken, faces hidden, hands wrung. But none of that is his concern. He has done his part. By mid-morning, the funeral begins, although that word might be too generous for what actually happens. There's no grand procession, no solemn choir, no velvet-lined hearse pulled by matching black horses. What you get, in a small village in the year 1300, is a plank of wood and 4 people trying not to drop it. The body is carried on a bier, a simple wooden board, sometimes the kitchen door in disguise, draped with a plain cloth if the family can spare it. There are no pallbearers in uniform. Just a few neighbors or distant cousins chosen by proximity and general availability. They walk slowly, partly out of respect, but mostly because the footing on the dirt path is unreliable and no one wants to be remembered as the one who tipped Uncle Henrik into the mud. The bier is not heavy, but the silence is. The little procession trails behind it in a loose and uneven line, the widow, if there is one, holding her cloak tight at the neck, a couple of siblings walking with the awkward stiffness of people not sure if they should be crying yet, a child being told to hush, and an uncle who's already whispering about inheritance before they reach the chapel door. The church itself stands at the center of the village, weathered and hunched, as if it too is tired of this routine. The bell has already tolled. Everyone knows why they're here. Inside, the air is damp and still. There are no flowers, no music, no wreaths. Just the sound of shuffling feet and a faint creak in the rafters that's either the wind or something with wings nesting overhead. There are candles lit, yes, but not for ambience. They're needed for light. The windows are too small, and the day is too dim. The priest stands at the front, near the altar, adjusting his robes with the quiet, patient slowness of a man who has done this too many times to rush it now. He is not drunk. He is simply old. And tired. And the kind of weary that seeps into the spine and never leaves. He knows most of the faces in the room, some well, some only from funerals. He nods once, then begins. The funeral rites are spoken in Latin, as they always are, and as always, no one fully understands them. But no one questions it either. The words don't need to be understood, they just need to be said. The priest's voice is steady, if quiet, and he moves through the blessing with careful precision, as though each phrase is a step along a path he knows by heart. There is no embellishment. No sermon. Just the words required, spoken as they've been spoken for centuries. The body, still wrapped in linen, rests at the front of the chapel. The hands are folded neatly, sometimes bound if they wouldn't stay put. The face is covered, unless someone felt brave enough to leave it uncovered for the prayers. If the eyes didn't close on their own, and this happens more often than you'd think, they were stitched shut earlier that morning. A few small threads, nothing elaborate. It's not done out of cruelty. It's done so the living can look at the dead without flinching. So the memory isn't spoiled by one last, unblinking stare. The family stands nearby, eyes lowered, hands clasped or clenched. Some look like they might weep. Others look like they already did, 2 days ago, in the dark, when no one was watching. A few glance sideways at each other, silently negotiating who will speak next, or whether anything should be said at all. There is no eulogy. Just the presence of people who knew the dead, standing still, hoping that stillness counts for something. When the final prayer is spoken, there's a pause. No one moves at first. Then someone clears their throat, a child shifts on their feet, and the murmuring begins. Because even in death, especially in death, people still talk. The whispering begins the moment the priest steps back. Not loud, not cruel, just the usual murmurs. The widow's new cloak, the son who didn't show up, the curious choice of burial shoes. Someone mutters about the pot of stew that's burning because no one stayed home to watch it. Another speculates whether the tools left in the deceased's shed are up for claiming yet. Elias stands near the rear, hands folded over the handle of his shovel, already thinking about the weight of the dirt. He watches the faces, listens to the voices, and knows exactly how long the moment of reverence will last, not much longer. This is what a funeral looks like in 1300 if you're poor, rural, and expected to return to your chores by sundown. It isn't grand. It isn't fair. But it's honest. A final goodbye wrapped in linen, folded into silence, and padded out with side comments about barley and boots. While peasants were buried in haste and linen, often remembered only by those who'd known them closely, the burials of the noble class followed a different order altogether, slower, costlier, and far more elaborate. For those born into wealth or station, the rituals of death began long before the body reached the earth. The moment of passing set into motion a well-rehearsed series of preparations. The first of these was prayer, not a handful of hurried blessings, but full days of formal liturgies, often chanted in Latin by priests brought in from neighboring parishes. In some cases, choirs were gathered. In others, monks were paid to recite scripture around the clock for the soul's safe journey. And though no one ever said it directly, it was understood that the more one paid, the further those prayers might carry. The care of the body itself was handled with great attention. The deceased was not washed by family members or neighbors, but by attendants trained in such matters. Hands were gloved. Water was scented, sometimes with rose or myrrh. Linens were finer, the sort reserved only for death or high feasts. Where a villager might be wrapped simply and quickly, a noble's body was prepared with layers of silk and folded cloth, chosen not only for dignity but for appearance. To slow the signs of death, aromatic herbs were carefully placed beneath the arms, along the neck, and sometimes within the torso. Sage, rosemary, bay leaves, hyssop, all used not only for their fragrance, but as an attempt to keep the body still and manageable until the procession. It wasn't a perfect science, but it gave the illusion of grace. In wealthier households, a form of embalming was practiced. Not what we would recognize today, but enough to preserve the features for viewing. In some cases, internal organs were removed and placed in separate containers: the heart, the liver, sometimes the brain. These might be buried in separate chapels, especially if the deceased had held lands in multiple regions. It was considered honorable, in a way, to leave a part of oneself in every place one had ruled. The burial attire was chosen with care. Robes of velvet or brocade, rich with embroidery. Family rings were left on fingers, sometimes with signets still visible. For men of rank, a sword might be laid across the chest, not for war, but for symbolism, a quiet reminder of service or duty, even in death. The funeral itself could stretch on for hours. Processions wound through town or across estates, led by riders or servants bearing crests and torches. Bells rang from the churches. Villagers stood at the roadside to watch. Those closest to the family walked slowly behind the bier, and though not all tears were genuine, everyone understood the role they were meant to play. The final resting place was not a field or hillside, but a family crypt, often beneath the church or within a walled enclosure set aside for the lineage. These vaults were made of stone and marked with inscriptions, usually Latin, carved deep into the face of the wall. Dates, titles, family lines. Some even included carved images of the deceased, laid out in repose with folded hands, sculpted faces turned slightly upward. Effigies, they were called. Meant to honor. Meant to last. Elias had seen one once, a tomb with a carved figure atop it, dressed in robes and armor, serene in expression. The likeness had been idealized, certainly. The stone figure appeared younger, broader of shoulder, and less troubled than the man had been in life. But that was the intent. Death had its own kind of flattery. The crypts were sealed carefully. Some with wax, others with stone. Doors were closed with iron keys, passed to heirs or held by stewards. The burial site was permanent, protected, and preserved. These weren't just graves. They were monuments. Symbols of lineage. Of legacy. Of having belonged to a world that measured importance in marble and time. And yet, as Elias would later think, standing again in the open graveyard on the edge of the village, no matter the richness of the robes or the weight of the tombstone, all bodies returned to the same earth. Some just arrive more formally than others. Elias had seen one of these burials once, not as a mourner, of course, but as a helper. The church had needed extra hands to stack firewood and steady the bier. He wasn't paid, but he was allowed to stand near the back, close enough to watch, far enough to be ignored. That's how it usually was. When the dead were noble and the work was quiet, Elias was sometimes asked to help, never named, never thanked, but always nearby, listening. When the last bell has tolled and the horses have turned home, when the velvet sleeves have stopped fluttering and the priest has tucked away his final prayer, that's when the talking begins. Not loudly. Not all at once. But gradually, like fog creeping in after a warm day. And in some ways, it's more honest than anything said during the service. A noble funeral ends with dignity. With stone. With sealing wax. But behind all that, just a few steps from the chapel or beneath the shade of a nearby oak, the whispers gather. Soft voices, heads turned slightly, shoulders angled just enough to pretend they're still mourning while adjusting their tone. Behind every carved effigy lies a very real man or woman. And behind every embroidered shroud is a memory someone has been waiting to share. Sometimes tender. Often, less so. Elias has heard them all. He doesn't seek them out, but he never needs to. He stands nearby with his shovel, still dusted with dry soil, hands resting on the handle. He listens without turning his head, because in truth, he's learned more about the world from funerals than sermons. The comments begin innocently enough. "Did you see who cried hardest?" someone asks, tilting her chin toward the widow, who dabs her eyes with a cloth that looks suspiciously untouched. "Do you think she'll remarry?" another whispers. "I heard her cousins already moved into the solar." There's a pause. Then a knowing hum. "The youngest son didn't even show," someone adds. "He's in Calais. Or drunk. Or both." And so it continues. Gossip that loops and weaves through the mourners like a second procession. There are the murmured reminders of debt. That tomb was paid for in borrowed coin and unpaid wages. We built it while eating barley with no salt. There are hints at past misbehavior. You know he once tried to joust a barrel. And mutterings about forged documents and quietly shifted property lines. The servants are usually the most generous with detail. They lean against the stable wall, arms crossed, eyes sharp, sharing stories the priest didn't include. Stories that weren't quite lies, but didn't quite fit the tone of the eulogy either. And always, someone starts the sentence with, "Don't say I said that." Which is exactly how you know they meant it to be remembered. Elias doesn't speak. He never does. But he listens. And in his quiet way, he understands something that the others might not admit. Gossip isn't always cruelty. Sometimes it's grief that hasn't found its manners yet. Sometimes it's the only kind of justice anyone can afford. Because when someone dies, the world keeps turning, but the space they leave behind needs to be filled. With stories. With sighs. With unfinished sentences. With small, nervous jokes that help everyone believe they are still part of the living. And so, people talk. They talk because it makes them feel close. Because silence feels too much like death. Because whispering the truth, even sloppily, feels better than pretending the world lost a saint. Elias, with his shovel and his patient posture, has heard it all. He's heard of affairs tucked beneath cloaks. Of feasts that ended in shouting. Of inheritances stolen with the ink still wet. He's heard who was loved, and who simply lasted. And though he rarely says a word, he remembers. Not the grand eulogies. Not the titles carved in stone. But the small things. The tone of a voice when someone said, "Finally." The way a steward flinched when the will was read. The foot that twitched as the soul left the body, a detail no one else noticed, but Elias did. And he keeps it. In the end, even the grandest lord is reduced to fragments. A few facts, a few lies, and a few whispered truths pass between people who needed to say something. Anything. Just to feel alive. And perhaps that's all remembrance really is. Not stone. not prayers. Just someone out there who still knows which side of the bed you snored on, and isn't afraid to mention it, softly, after the last hymn fades. For all the whispered stories and muddy boots, it's easy to forget that burial, even the simplest kind, didn't belong entirely to the villagers. It belonged to the church. And the church, being what it was in the year 1300, had rules. Many of them. To be buried properly meant being buried on consecrated ground. The soil had to be blessed. The land had to be watched over by the church, however loosely. If a village graveyard hadn't been formally consecrated, then technically, no one should be resting there at all. Not that it stopped anyone. But it did mean that some graves were comforted by prayers, and others were simply tolerated by silence. Who got to lie where wasn't left to chance, or even to affection. Proximity to the church walls was a kind of status. The closer your bones were to the altar, the more favorably your life was presumed to have gone. Nobles and priests rested beneath stone, often inside the building itself. Wealthy tradesmen and pious donors claimed ground near the doors. And the further out you went, toward the back, the slope, the scraggly edge where the brambles crept in, the humbler the souls became. If you died with money, you got a Mass Latin spoken clearly, candles lit with intention, and maybe even a toll of the bell if the priest was in the mood. A few silver coins could buy a great deal of dignity, even in death. If you didn't, well, the dirt didn't care, and neither did time. A priest might come to say a few hurried words, more out of duty than devotion. But mostly, you were lowered into the ground with little more than the memory of who you were, and the hope that someone still cared enough to visit, at least once, before the grass reclaimed the spot. And then there were those who didn't get buried at all, at least, not in the places most would call holy. The church held strong opinions on how one ought to die. Peacefully. Within the faith. With confession, if possible. But if your death fell outside those lines, if you had taken your own life, or been declared a heretic, or died while under excommunication, then the rules changed quickly, and not in your favor. Bodies of the excommunicated were often refused burial on church grounds. Some were buried outside the walls, beyond the hedges, in unblessed earth that the priest would not even glance toward. Others were simply left to be dealt with quietly, a patch dug in the woods, or beneath the old tree where no one built anything. And then there was the bad corner. Every village had one, though no one called it that officially. A stretch of land at the edge of the graveyard where the grass grew patchier and the soil turned to clay. It was where you might end up if your sins were many and your coins were few. If you'd been suspected of sorcery, or known to argue with the priest too often. If your final act was judged unworthy of prayer. And yes, in more than one case, if you were excommunicated, you were buried in the same spot as the man who owed taxes, and the stray dog no one had claimed. There were no headstones. No visitors. Just a shared patch of silence and the occasional curious crow. Elias, for his part, avoided the bad corner whenever he could. Not out of fear, exactly, but something close to it. A sense that even the ground had an opinion, and some places remembered the weight of shame more deeply than others. But the thing about rules, especially old ones, church ones, is that they are not always evenly applied. Some priests bent them. Some ignored them. Some gave masses for the undeserving. Some denied prayers out of spite. And so, like most things in 1300, whether you rested in peace or just rested, often came down to who remembered your name, and how much they were willing to pay for it. In the end, the grave still closes. The earth still settles. But for some, the path to that final stillness is a little less smooth. A little less kind. And occasionally, if your luck was especially poor, a little more crowded. By the time the body reaches the ground, anything worth keeping has already been removed. It's not out of cruelty. It's just practical. The dead don't need tunics. The living do. A body in 1300 is usually buried in a linen shroud, plain, homespun, and tied at the feet. If it's a good day, maybe the shroud is bleached. If it's not, The weave is loose, and the edges are frayed, but it's still enough to wrap the person with dignity. That's the word used, at least. Dignity. But really, it's a question of budget and what's left in the household stores. Their tunic, their actual clothing, rarely goes with them. Wool costs too much. Buttons take time to make. Cloaks can be refitted. Shoes, especially, are too valuable to waste. They are taken off gently, early in the preparation, and placed aside to be dried, patched, and eventually worn again. Sometimes by a brother. Sometimes by a neighbor. Occasionally, by the very man who dug the grave. Elias still wears a pair of boots he got that way. Sturdy ones. Soft at the ankle. They'd belonged to a miller, dead 4 winters ago, who apparently didn't need them where he was going. Elias had helped with the burial. The widow offered them without sentiment, and he accepted them the same way. He doesn't think about it much. Except when they squeak a little, which they do in the left heel. It's not morbid. It's just life. Clothes were handed down the way stories were, altered, adjusted, made to fit. A tunic might survive 3 or 4 owners before becoming a rag. A belt could last a decade. A cloak might see 2 weddings and a funeral before being buried in a chest for moths to find. And there was no shame in it. You didn't weep over garments. You wore them. You fixed them. You stretched them to another season. Grief and economy were stitched together, whether you liked it or not. If you lived in 1300, death didn't just take a person. It rearranged your household. It reshuffled the blankets, the spoons, the tools, the boots. You didn't mourn privately. You mourned in wool that didn't quite fit your shoulders. People today talk about sentimental objects, a scarf with perfume still on it, a watch that ticks softly in the drawer. But in the villages of the Middle Ages, the line between memory and utility was far more blurred. You might have been upset because your ex kept your hoodie when you broke up. In 1300? Elias has seen so many times, someone would keep the dead person's boots, and another person would marry the widow by Tuesday. The world kept moving. The fields didn't care if you were wearing borrowed shoes. The cows still needed milking. And no one was going to weave a new tunic just because yours ended up folded under 6 feet of clay. So when someone died, you cried if you needed to. You sang if the mood struck. But you also collected the clothes, brushed off the dirt, and passed them along. Grief came with a thread count. And most of it, in the end, was worn. After the burial, the next step is always the same, the meal. Not in celebration. Not even in remembrance, really. Just, in habit. In hunger. In the way that food becomes something to do when there's nothing left to say. The table is long. Rough wood, uneven legs. Covered with a cloth that's seen too many winters to hold any color. Bread sits in torn pieces across the board. There's a pot of stew, barley and root vegetables, salted meat if there was any left over from the last slaughter. A pitcher of ale. A bowl of small apples. And if the dead had influence, or a generous niece, maybe a pie. But only one. And it goes quickly. No one calls it a feast, though that's technically what it is. People sit elbow to elbow, not quite meeting each other's eyes. The air is thick with the sound of chewing and shallow conversation. Most are too tired to cry, and too polite to bring up anything uncomfortable. So they talk about the weather. About the state of the road. About the chickens. They talk around the grief, like it's a spill on the table they're pretending not to see. Some mourners eat with gratitude. Others with guilt. A few with nothing but habit. Hunger, after all, is not sentimental. It arrives whether or not you're grieving. Some flirt. Because grief sits beside desire more often than people like to admit. And nothing makes life feel more urgent than watching someone else's end being folded into the ground. Elias sits near the door, as always. Away from the hearth, away from the main bench. He eats with dirty hands, quietly, carefully. The bread is dense. The stew is warm. The ale is weak, which is probably for the best. He doesn't speak much. A name is supposed to mean something. It's what you're called, what you sign, if you're lucky enough to be able to write. It's shouted across fields, whispered in sleep, carved into the edge of a pew. It should linger. It should matter. But in the end, most names don't go very far. The priest might write it down in the parish register, if he liked you, if he remembered, if the ink wasn't frozen that morning. The steward might log it for tax purposes, a brief scroll on a ledger that would one day be eaten by mice or mildew. Beyond that, the name drifts. Sometimes, if you were loved well, someone lights a candle for you once a year. They speak your name under their breath and let the flame flicker. It's a small kind of immortality. A soft echo in the hallway of memory. Other times, it just disappears. No scandal. No tragedy. Just goes. Elias thinks about that more than he admits. He tries not to linger on it, but after you've buried enough people, you start to notice the way memory fades. The way a name can feel so sharp one day, and then vanish the next like mist in the sun. He remembers faces more than names. Posture. Voice. The sound of laughter, maybe. The way someone carried their bucket, or how they sighed when they sat down too quickly. And sometimes, when he's alone, he looks down at the boots on his feet, worn soft at the heels, creased at the toe, and he wonders who they belonged to before. By the time the last bowl has been scraped, the last bench tucked in, and the grave smoothed over with the back of a spade, Elias's day is done. Not in the way we say that now, emails cleared, shoes kicked off, but in the way a body says no more. His arms are heavy. His knees ache. Dirt clings to his sleeves, to the back of his neck, to the corners of his nails and half-moons of dry brown. He doesn't undress fully. Just shrugs off the outer layer, sets the boots aside. The straw mattress is lumpy and cold, but familiar. It doesn't ask questions. It just waits. As he lies down, the silence folds in around him, not sharp, but thick, like cloth pressed over the ears. There's no fire lit. Just the soft creak of wood and the occasional sigh of wind through the cracks in the wall. The sound of the shovel still echoes. Not loudly. But it's there. The rhythm of it. The pause and lift. The thud into damp ground. He's heard it so many times it's become a second heartbeat. He thinks, briefly, about the one he buried today. He tries to picture their face, but it's already slipping. He remembers the curve of the spine, the way the shroud bunched slightly at the shoulder, the hush in the room as the last prayer was spoken. Did they dream of something better, he wonders? Did they have a favorite song? Did they ever hope to see spring one more time? He doesn't know. The room is dark now, save for a faint thread of moonlight resting on the wall. Elias doesn't move. His eyes are closed, but his thoughts haven't quite settled. Not yet. Sleep comes slowly after a burial. Not because of fear or sadness, but because part of him is still out there. In the graveyard. In the cold. Listening to the wind shift the grass. In his mind, he sees the rows. The soft, uneven mounds. The slight tilt of the older stones. He remembers who lies where. Which grave sinks in winter. Which corner always grows nettles, no matter how often it's cleared. He doesn't say their names aloud. He rarely did, even when he was younger. But he holds them. Quietly. Like one might hold a handful of small coins, or a memory that doesn't belong to you but feels too important to lose. He's not a priest. Not a poet. He doesn't write anything down. But still, he watches. Even here, half asleep, half warm beneath a wool blanket that smells faintly of smoke and dust, even here, he's keeping track. Because not all remembrance comes with bells or headstones or books. Sometimes, it's just the echo of a name in someone else's mind. A pair of boots worn long after their owner is gone. A moment of stillness in the dark, where someone like Elias is still thinking of them. He doesn't need anyone to know. It's enough that he remembers. And maybe, if you're here listening, far from that little village, lost in time, with your own eyes softening into sleep, Maybe you're that kind of person too. The kind who keeps a quiet watch. The kind who remembers.